new this morning as the winter weather pushes out. The pests are coming back in. The city of Grand Rapids specifically being called out as a region across a national watch list for disease-spreading pest activity. Our city, among other cities like Louisville, Seattle, Cleveland, and Boston. Dr. Mike Bentley is a board-certified entomologist and the vice president of training and technical services for the National Pest Management Association. The association, by the way, the one that released the report. Dr. Bentley, good morning to you. For those that don't know what this report is, what does it specifically look at?
Yeah, good morning. Well, thanks for having me on. So this is a report we put together where we take current and forecasted weather data, and we marry that with what we know about the biology behavior of a select number of pests, those that we consider public health pests. So those are going to be the things like ticks, mosquitoes, rodents, cockroaches, the nasty stuff that vectors disease. And we look at weather conditions across the country, what's currently going on, and what's forecasted to happen over the next few months. And we look for where conditions are right, where conducive conditions may be an area where, some of these public health pests that vector disease may do particularly well in certain areas, and Grand Rapids was one of those.
Yeah, okay, so that's leading right into my next question. So what should we expect here in the region around Grand Rapids? Of course, I know we've lived this really harsh winter, first harsh winter in a couple of years. So what should we be expecting?
Yeah, great question. So, we typically think, all right, wintertime, pest pressure is going to go down. We're not seeing a lot of flying or crawling insects around. So usually it's good news when we have a harsh winter. But in reality, there's one pest in particular, and that's rodents, where we typically see those pressures inside of our homes increase as temperatures start to drop. Rodents don't do so well when it gets cold outside. They need a nice warm place to survive. And also their food sources outside, typically, seeds and grasses and things, there's not in a lot of abundance whenever it's wintertime.
Yeah, and if we can, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're good. I was going to say, fortunately for them, unfortunately for us, our homes become the perfect place where it's nice and warm and there's plenty of food available. So they typically move inside of our homes during the wintertime. So we see a huge spike in rodent pressure. And rodents like rats and mice, they can spread over 35 different diseases to us. They contaminate our food. So it's a huge concern when we have rodents living in and around our structures. And while there's been a huge abundance of snowfall in the Grand Rapids area, that snowfall just means that the longer that snow's around, the less likely those natural food sources are going to be available as we transition into spring, meaning that they're going to need to stay inside of our homes, constantly looking for food we're providing them up until those springtime conditions show up.
Yeah, we're talking about pests that kind of bring the heebie-jeebies to a few. For example, our chief meteorologist is sitting right next to me, and the faces she is making are not great. I mean,
not what I want to hear.
We were also, looking at some video of pests, the ticks that you were speaking of, and the mice. So we're taking a look at the public health index right now that you guys put out. Of course, on the list of cities here, Grand Rapids, Louisville, Kentucky, the nation's capital. We've got Florida, New Orleans, many big metro populations across our country. So can you tell us how you arrived to the conclusions in each one? And now each of these different cities has a different threat. So can you kind of explain what the methodology is as you go through each city?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, when we talk about weather conditions, how that influences pest pressure, there's going to be a lot of different factors that go into that. The conditions that we're seeing right now in Grand Rapids, strikingly different than what we're talking about in, say, Miami, Florida, right? So Miami, Florida, the pest pressure there is going to be a lot more mosquito-heavy, mosquito-focused. Grand Rapids right now, the big focus is going to be on rodent pressure. And it's really going to, what happens over the next few months is really going to dictate kind of what we expect to see and what those concerns are going to be and how those shift through the different pest pressures. So as we start to transition into spring, it's forecasted that it's going to be a very, very rainy spring and really soggy for that area. And that's going to be good in some cases, but bad in others. That overabundance of moisture is a conducive condition for a ton of pests, particularly for mosquitoes and for ticks. And even all that snowfall right now, all of that snow that's on the ground, as that melts, that's only going to contribute to the moisture conditions. So if we start to see an early spring, and I mean, the only predictable thing about weather the past few years is it's been pretty unpredictable. So it's hard to exactly nail down what's going to happen. But if we do start to see this early spring, that snow melts early and we have a really, really soggy spring, that overabundance of moisture is going to cause a huge spike in vegetation growth, which is going to provide perfect ground cover for ticks.
Okay.
Um,
Ugh.
the more vegetation growth you have, especially around homes, that just means that ticks are going to expand their area. It's going to bring those ticks closer to structures, increasing our risk of exposure to them. But those standing water conditions that are created from all that moisture are where we really start to see mosquito issues pop up. And the sooner in the year that happens, the earlier those mosquitoes can start their breeding season. The more mosquitoes we have earlier in the year just means the more mosquitoes we're going to have in the summer months, when the last thing we want to be dealing with is biting disease carrying pests.
Yeah, again, we popped our chief on camera as you were kind of explaining all of that. And you're mentioning, if this happens early in spring, we could be seeing more of these pests. What about summer? What does this mean for the summer? Does this have any bearing on what happens to us later in the year?
Yeah, unfortunately it does. So the sooner in the year that we start to have pest activity, that just means that it's going to be a buggier summer. So if mosquitoes and ticks are their activity picks up sooner in the year than traditionally expected, that means they're going to start reproducing sooner. That means numbers are going to start exponentially increasing sooner. So those July, August months where we typically see what we would consider peak pest pressure, those populations could be much larger, meaning that it's an increase of exposure for all of these different pest threats. And I know this is a lot of bad news, but there is a silver lining to this. There
Okay,
are
yeah, what's
things that
that?
we could do to protect ourselves.
Oh, good.
So we're not just going to be overrun by all these pests. There are some things that we can do to protect ourselves. So
Can you speak a little bit to what those things are? Because I'm making an extensive list after seeing all the video that they keep playing of the mice and the rats, the mosquitoes and the ticks. It's too much for me.
yeah. Sorry about the B-roll footage. I
No,
apologize.
it
Next time we'll
paints a
look at
visual
these
picture.
Yes.
and things. How about that?
Yeah, there you go.
So, yeah, well, I mentioned vegetation growth. One of the most important things that homeowners can do as we transition to that springtime is make sure that your landscape is well maintained. So, leaf piles, overabundance of fallen sticks, firewood piles maybe up against the house, and just simply grass itself, allowing any of that overgrown vegetation to get out of control is only going to increase your risk of exposure. So make sure that landscape's well maintained. Look for any cracks or crevices around a home. Something as small as a number 2 pencil. So any gap or crack or crevice as wide as a number 2 pencil, mice can squeeze through.
Oh my
And
gosh.
ants
Wow.
and cockroaches can fit through something even smaller. So look for those holes and cracks, seal those things up really well, and most importantly, work with your pest management professional. They are trained to know where all these things are. It's second nature to them. They're highly specialized to be able to identify these conducive conditions and fix these things early so you avoid ever having a problem to begin with. Being proactive is the number one most important step. So work with your professional and they'll be able to help take care of all these problems.
I'd
for you.
imagine you'd probably want to start now, really starting to prepare for some of those things.
Yep.
Especially with, and I know you kind of touched on this a little bit, but our winter seasons are getting shorter, right? That's something that we're seeing climatologically continue to trend. Shorter winter seasons, longer growing seasons, longer pest seasons now resulting from that, right? So with the larger pest season, are we seeing diseases become more widespread or more of a prevalent issue within those pests because the season's longer, or are those two not correlated?
No, I think I think we could say that there's some correlation there. I think most importantly, though, when we talk about the risk of exposure, certainly the risk of exposure increases. The more of those disease-carrying pests that are out there, and the longer they're allowed that window of activity, the wider that gets throughout the year, then the greater the risk of exposure. We can't necessarily always say, hey, you're guaranteed that the incidence rate of disease is going to go up because there's more of them out there. But the more likely you are to be exposed to them, the greater the risk. So, but I mean, you hit the nail on the head. What's happening now is that we're having these shorter winters and longer periods of activity every year. And it's allowing pest activity to increase. It's allowing populations to grow further. And we're even seeing range expansion much further north for a number of these problematic and dangerous disease-spreading pests than we've seen 20, 30 years ago. So the total population that is at risk and exposure of ticks, which is one of the fastest growing arthropod disease vectors that we've got out there right now, mosquitoes, rodents, we're only seeing these things increase. So the problem is actually growing. Which means that we need to, as homeowners, be more vigilant, make sure that we're properly protecting ourselves, using mosquito repellent and insect repellent, making sure that we're doing our due diligence for inspecting around our homes, and maintaining that relationship and working well with your pest management professional to make sure that you're proactive all year long, because we really can't take a break. Even though it's winter, you need to be looking for these conducive conditions now, because it doesn't take long for these pest problems to explode.
If we could pull the index of cities back up just really quickly, and while we have you still, I want to ask you about, you've picked out about 10 or so, or maybe even more cities there on this map across the country. When you're looking at the data across the country, how do you guys sit down and say, all right, these are the cities that we're going to highlight? And I know it all deals with your data that you've collected from the Weather Service, but how do you guys sit down and say, all right, these are the pins that we're going to place on the map here, and these are the more impactful areas?
Yeah, so what we typically try to do is that there's a couple weather conditions and climatic factors that really trigger pest pressure. So things like, what we just talked about, early warming conditions. If we have an area that's forecasted to be unseasonably warm, so a non-typical winter, so it's going to be a much shorter winter. We see springtime temperatures, getting warmer sooner in the year. That's going to be a red flag. And anytime you see that, particularly married with early onset rainfall, those are the two things that can really, really spell disaster for certain areas, because that's going to be, all of your pest activity is going to increase, but those standing water conditions are what can really, really ramp up mosquito activity and tick activity. There are some other factors that can play a role in that. Like in the Grand Rapids area, the fact that there's so much snowfall in the area is good for mosquito activity, because it may actually help to suppress mosquito activity later into the spring, which is great news. On the opposite side of that, though, the longer that snowfall sticks around, the less abundant those natural food sources are going to be for the other public health pests, those rodents. And so that just means that they're going to be more reliant on, home provided food resources, things that are in our pantry, or maybe stuff that's in our garages, the pet food, bird seed, those kinds of things. So it's going to just, where it's kind of like squeezing a balloon. We're getting a little bit of a benefit of maybe a delay in mosquito activity in that area, but we're probably, as a result, going to see a potential prolonged pressure inside of structures and homes from those other disease-spreading rodents.
All right, Dr. Mike Bentley, we really appreciate your time and your insight. And of course, if you're a homeowner watching this, get prepared now. Dr. Bentley, thank you very much. It's 9:22. We'll be back after a short break.